In February of 1938, Australia faced the very real prospect of war. Less than 2 decades after the defeat of the Kaiser's Germany in World War I, it was becoming increasingly clear that the new German government, led by Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party, were willing to risk repeating the catastrophe of 1914. It had been just under 2 years since Germany had remilitarized the Rhineland, and the Austrian Anschluss was mere weeks away. With the Munich Agreement still in the future, and the Japanese rampaging through China, having essentially defeated the conventional forces of the Kuomintang by this point, a global war was an all too easily imagined risk. It was in this environment that the Australian Commonwealth Naval Board, or ACNB, identified the need for a class of general-purpose naval ships, which were termed local defence vessels. These ships were intended to conduct mine warfare and take on anti-submarine duties. They didn't need to be big or complex or top of the line. In fact, quite the opposite. Priority was given to things like ease of construction, ease of operation, and the ability to design and produce the vessel, as much as possible, domestically in Australia. The Bathurst-class corvette was the nation's answer. HMAS Bathurst was laid down on the 10th of February 1940 and commissioned on the 6th of December that same year. She was the first of what would eventually be 60 ships of the class produced in Australian shipyards, ultimately becoming by far the RAN's most numerous combat ship in the Second World War fleet. Though slow and lightly armed, even by the standards of the day, the Bathursts were enormously flexible and valuable combatants. They were deployed in multiple theatres across the world, taking up roles as submarine hunters, convoy escorts, mine hunters, survey vessels, troop and supply transports, basically anything the Navy needed them to do that didn't really require the speed or firepower of a destroyer or a cruiser. And perhaps even more importantly, they were very much a homegrown Australian ship. Yes, admittedly, certain very high-end components did come in from overseas, but the ships were designed here. Their engines and other fairly high-tech subsystems for the time were built here, and their hulls were made from Australian steel. While they were far from our most potent defenders, more so than just about any other ships of the fleet, they were very much our defenders. Australia at the beginning of 2025 faces a situation which would be pretty familiar to the ACNB of 1938, with a rapidly growing militaristic power to our north and a European continent that seems to be avoiding large-scale conflict by the skin of its teeth. Australia is once again undertaking a program to rapidly grow its navy, committing to purchase 11 general-purpose frigates under Project C3000, most of which will be built domestically, just like the Bathursts. However, these vessels, as capable and valuable as they surely will be, are not expected to be joining the fleet until 2029, and not meaningfully in numbers until some time after that. Although pretty fast by modern standards, there are plenty of people who look at that timeline and simply do not think it is fast enough. So that begs the question, if we wanted to, if the Australian government decided to act on an imminent threat, could we change that timeline? Could Australia build the 21st century equivalent of the Bathurst class if it needed to today? What would that ship look like, and is the Australian military industrial base sufficient to generate the kind of craft that could fill the role that we might need filled? This video will consider those questions. First, before we can start to figure out what a modern Bathurst would look like, we need to understand a little bit about the World War II era original. The Bathurst was a corvette, and quite a small one, at least by modern standards. The ship was 57 metres long and displaced 730 tons standard, or 1,025 fully loaded. A Bathurst's main weapon was a 3-inch 12-pounder main gun, or more commonly later on in the war, a 4-inch Mark 19 high-angle gun, which was a more capable anti-air weapon as well as just overall more powerful than the 12-pounder. A number of Oerlikon 20mm and Bofors 40mm cannons made up the secondary armament, with light machine guns and depth charges rounding out the weapon's load. It should be noted, though, that the specific armament varied from hull to hull, and this is just a general overview of what was typical. The vessels were principally designed for submarine hunting and for anti-mine work, though, as discussed earlier, they ended up with a much wider range of jobs over the course of the conflict. To facilitate their underwater work, they were equipped with the then still fairly new ASDIC device, essentially early sonar, and still very much cutting edge at the time. So to understand what a modern Bathurst might look like, we can compare the old Bathurst against its contemporaries. Ignoring the cruisers, which were in a completely different class entirely, essentially the Tier 1 ships of their day, let's look at some of the other ships of the fleet. The ill-fated HMAS Waterhen, which was sunk in 1941, was a World War I era W-class destroyer. At 1,100 tons standard displacement, it wasn't vastly bigger than a Bathurst, but in terms of armament, the comparison was pretty stark. Waterhen had 4 4-inch main guns and 2 20mm pom-pom guns for air defense, plus both torpedoes and depth charges. It was also faster, more than doubling the 15 knots that a Bathurst was expected to make. Or we could compare the famed HMAS Stuart of the Scrap Iron Flotilla, another World War I era destroyer, this time roughly twice the displacement of a Bathurst. Stuart started the war with 5 4.7-inch guns, 3 dedicated anti-aircraft guns including a 3-incher, torpedoes, depth charges, and, again, that enormous speed advantage over the Bathursts. Even the most directly comparable ship in the Australian fleet of the time, the Grimsby-class sloop, was quite a bit bigger than the Bathursts, weighing in at 1,000 tons standard load and about 1,500 tons full. And they were better armed. Though specifics varied from ship to ship, a typical Grimsby in Australian service boasted at least 3 4-inch main anti-aircraft guns and a number of secondary guns ranging from 3-pounders up to Bofors 40mm cannons, generally in larger numbers than any Bathurst. So, if we wanted to think about the World War II fleet in the parlance of 2025's RAN, Australia had basically 3 tiers of ships. The cruisers were our Tier 1 vessels, capable of scrapping with the big boys and called upon to do so when the need arose. Our destroyers and frigates were Tier 2, mainly designed for escort duties, but fast and reasonably well armed, capable of operating in dangerous theatres like the Mediterranean. Finally, the sloops and corvettes made up Tier 3. Small, slow, and relatively lightly armed, though the sloops and frigates weren't actually so far apart, these ships were meant for lighter duties, generally closer to home in less contested waters, with the Bathursts very much being at the bottom of that third tier. However, despite this limited size and armament, the Bathursts were still able to do good work. Through the war, the class was credited with multiple submarine kills, they had the anti-air armament to deal with some torpedo bombers, and while they had limited utility in a fleet battle, they had enough firepower to be capable escort and patrol vessels. So, what would the modern equivalent of a Tier 3 ship look like? Something capable of doing useful and important work, but without the costs associated with a modern major surface combatant like a general-purpose frigate? Well, to answer that, we need to know what we might call on a modern Bathurst to do. First, a modern Bathurst would need to be capable of maritime infrastructure defence. This would include harbour and port defence, a significantly more challenging job today than would have been faced by similar vessels in the past. Traditional challenges such as sea mines, diesel-electric submarines, and light surface raiders have been supplemented by more modern threats, such as autonomous or remotely controlled suicide drones, and not only those in the air, but also on the surface of the water. Ukraine, with its jet ski-sized sea baby drones in the Black Sea, has shown the enormous threat posed by remote-controlled suicide boats to ships in port. While these would not likely be so much of a threat to Australian mainland ports, forward bases, such as the Lobram Naval Base on Manus Island, or the limited port facilities at Christmas Island, or any other forward operating bases that Australia may find itself operating out of, will not be able to rely on the same defence through distance that our mainland ports enjoy. Maritime infrastructure includes many things beyond just port and harbour responsibilities, however. Subsea cables, which carry the vast majority of Australia's data and communications bandwidth, would be threatened in any conflict, much as Russia and China are fairly blatantly cutting Europe's cables as part of the periphery of the Ukraine conflict today. This reliance on cables may only become more acute if projects such as Sun Cable ever get off the ground, wherein Australian renewable energy is proposed to be sent to Southeast Asia via subsurface cables. Another major piece of maritime infrastructure would be Australia's extensive offshore oil and gas facilities, such as those on the Northwest Shelf or the Ichthys Field north of Derby in Western Australia. These high-value facilities are vulnerable to long-range air attack, which will be challenging for the Navy to defend against and will require the presence of high-end surface combatants capable of area air defence, at least at some times during the conflict. However, at other times, if and when air operations are partially suppressed, for example, these facilities will remain vulnerable to much less expensive and sophisticated shorter-range attacks, probably from surface and subsurface assets. By having lower-end capabilities available and in the area to defend these facilities, Australia forces its adversaries to choose either not to attack these platforms or to expend costly long-range capabilities to undertake that attack. Second, and probably most obvious, convoy escort duties will remain critical to an island nation like Australia. In any major combat scenario with China, Australia's northern trade routes would likely be closed to it, and its western and eastern trade routes, through the Suez across the Indian Ocean and to New Zealand and onward to the Americas across the Pacific, would become the nation's major lifelines, but both could be threatened by certain Chinese capabilities. Given the ranges involved, air threats are likely minimal, and commerce raiding with surface ships, which has been a core part of naval warfare for centuries at this point, is likely to be significantly more difficult than it once was, given the enormously capable airborne and spaceborne sensors available to Australia and its allies. This leaves subsurface threats, particularly nuclear-powered attack submarines operating in the Western Indian and Southern Pacific Oceans, which have neither the range limitations of air power nor the exposure risk of surface forces. Thus, any modern Bathurst in Australian service will need a decent level of competence in anti-submarine warfare, with the capability both to detect submarine threats and to prosecute any targets it identifies. This would likely be the class's primary mission, and the mission around which the vessel should probably be optimized. Third, more general escort duties would almost certainly be in short supply in any Australian amphibious campaign in our northern approaches. In 2024, the Australian government formalised its acceleration of the Army's landing craft medium and landing craft heavy programs, committing to the purchase of 18 of the former and 8 of the latter. These ships will represent an enormous step up in Australia's dispersed amphibious capability, with the larger vessels displacing nearly 4,000 tonnes and being capable of operating at ranges of up to 2,000 nautical miles. However, these vessels will be minimally armed and will need escort in all but the most permissive of environments. Unfortunately, even Australia's planned expanded major surface combatant fleet is unlikely to be large enough to be able to both manage its current and anticipated wartime duties and to have enough firepower spare to escort these vessels as they move through the littoral waters of Australia's northern approaches. A modern Bathurst would be ideal for this role as well. Finally, in addition to enabling sea lift in the form of the landing craft, the modern Bathursts might be called on to undertake sea lift directly, at least on very small scales, carrying out limited resupply and troop transport missions just as their predecessors in World War II did. Incidental missions like mine warfare, maybe more mine laying than mine sweeping, recon and SIGINT could also potentially be required, if specialised modular equipment were to be procured at least. Now, at this point, if you watched my earlier video on the C3000 General Purpose Frigate program, you're probably seeing some major similarities in the likely mission set for these two vessels, and that's not a coincidence. There are only a certain number of high priority missions that a light surface combatant is required for in Australian service, and both the General Purpose Frigate and the modern Bathurst would fall into overlapping niches, further increasing that crossover. So if that is the case, and we are buying 11 of the general purpose frigates, why might we need a modern Bathurst in the first place? Well, in a perfect world, or at least the kind of perfect world where we still need a military, we wouldn't. If we had all the money, all the time, and all the shipbuilding infrastructure and workforce that we could ever want, then you'd probably just build more general purpose frigates and they do a better job. But in this world, we don't have all that, far from it. Under the current proposed timeline and assuming no delays, we'll be lucky to be commissioning our first overseas built frigate from Project C3000 in 2029. Realistically, it's entirely possible that pushes back to 2030. And for a meaningful capability from domestic built hulls, we're probably looking at a solid 3 to 5 years past that point at best. The idea behind the modern Bathurst, by contrast, is for a ship type that, given the political will, we could build relatively cheaply and relatively quickly at a wider variety of facilities around the country, potentially providing capability much sooner and cheaper, at least per hull. To achieve that, however, the modern Bathurst would, more or less by definition, need to accept some capability sacrifices relative to its contemporaries coming out of C3000. And these sacrifices are likely to be significant. Let's have a quick look at what we might consider including on a vessel like this, where sacrifices might need to be made, and where we'd probably need to spend money to make sure that our ship is capable of actually undertaking useful missions. I've broken the components of the ship down into subcategories, which will help build up my idea of what a modern Bathurst might look like, piece by piece. Let's start with the very basics of any vehicle, land, sea or air. propulsion, fuel, top speed, and endurance. The engines and the capabilities associated with them are the first area where we can probably look to find savings compared to other modern military vessels. Expensive, high-end, and highly capable propulsion systems add enormously to the cost of modern naval vessels, and choosing to skimp here could shave quite a bit off the cost of one of these proposed ships. For a start, these ships don't need to be fast. As escorts, they really only need to be able to keep up with the container ships and fuel tankers that tend to trundle along at about 15 to 20 knots. The modern Bathurst would probably only need performance akin to an OPV, which tend to top out between 20 and 25 knots, and which cruise at about 15. Ideally, this low speed will also allow for fairly efficient engines that would grant significant endurance, but exactly what we should aim for in that category is not immediately obvious. Consider a plausible, typical mission for these vessels: escorting convoys carrying refined fuel from the Middle East to the port of Fremantle in Western Australia. If you assume the port of Suez as a worst-case scenario origin port, and that the Red Sea is open to shipping, you're looking at a journey of roughly 8,000 nautical miles, which is well beyond the realistic expectations as an unrefueled range for any ship of the size we're talking about here. Given a 15-knot cruising speed, that's also more than 3 weeks of travel time, let alone any delays at either end, pushing up against the typical endurance of these types of ships in terms of food and other consumables. So a resupply and refueling stop or two will be necessary, but ideally these will be minimized. Perhaps a top off at Exmouth on the way out and a single stop somewhere like Sri Lanka, or, if necessary, at an Indian Ocean territory like Cocos Keeling or Christmas Islands, or maybe even the US facility at Diego Garcia, might allow much more reasonable endurances of perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 nautical miles, and stores endurance of 3 to 4 weeks, again much more typical for an OPV. Endurance and logistics will also play a role in selecting how these ships should be fueled. While gas turbines, often paired with diesel engines, are very popular for naval vessels due to their ability to merge efficiency with speed when needed, these systems are more complex and costly than this vessel really requires. Diesel engines are a ubiquitous commercial off-the-shelf technology that are well understood across the world, including in Australia. For example, when it comes time to crew these vessels, fitters experienced with large diesel engines could likely be brought in from Australia's mining industry with limited retraining, though they might need some time to get their sea legs. Diesel as a fuel is also ubiquitous, and we could fuel up these vessels just about anywhere they sailed. For that matter, refined diesel is likely to be one of Australia's major imports during any conflict, and keeping the supply lines to Australia open more or less also guarantees keeping supply lines open for potential refueling spots along the way. So diesel would be the first pass option here. Simple, readily available, cheap, and ubiquitous. Ideally, we would also make as many concessions as we could to noise reduction without adding materially to the cost. This might make a diesel-electric generator driving a pump jet or electric motor preferable to a more traditional direct drive diesel engine, though that would need to be balanced with cost and availability compared against acoustic signature, mechanical reliability, and fuel efficiency. Sensors are some of the most exquisite, and therefore expensive, components of modern warships. So again, any sacrifices we can make here to capability are likely to have a disproportionate effect on the overall cost of the ships. This is also the first area where we can make choices which strongly prioritise Australian content. If Australia ever finds itself in a situation where it needs to build ships like these, then odds are most of the rest of the world will be trying to do something similar. That will put enormous pressure on supply chains and could well blow out delivery times for critical systems. When buying from Australian companies, we can at least ensure that we will be top priority for finished systems, though there may still be unavoidable crunches for certain subcomponents. For the ship's primary sensors, its radar, the most obvious and probably best option here is to reuse the same radar system that the ADF already utilises for land-based medium-range air defences. That is, we should implement the same CEA technology suite that combines the medium-range COPS and the shorter-range CTAC radar for the NASAMS land-based surface-to-air missile batteries. Compared with the more well-known CFAR-2 radar that currently adorns the Anzac class, these are relatively small and light radars. In Australian Army service, they are currently mounted on a truck and a Hawkeye vehicle respectively. That gives them two key advantages. Number one, integrating them into an existing hull design will be easier because of the lower weight. And number two, they're almost certainly cheaper than the full-scale CFAR-2 and probably more practical to manufacture in the kind of very large numbers which would likely be required in the scenario where Australia is gearing up for a major fight. Perhaps more importantly though, they're also a domestic, fully sovereign capability, the manufacturing of which could potentially be scaled up relatively quickly in the event of a war or the serious threat of one. Better yet, the Australian government has partially nationalised CEA Technologies, the company which manufactures these radars, so there would be no question about customer prioritisation. If Australia needed these radars, we can be sure that they would be forthcoming. Employing these sensors would give the vessels excellent medium-range air search and targeting radar capabilities, and even better capabilities in the very short ranges that CTAC is designed to work at. Understandably, CA technologies are fairly cagey about the precise capabilities of their radars, but we do know that the AN-MPQ-64 Sentinel radar, which the CEA products have displaced in the ADF's NASAMS air defence system, have an unclassified useful range of roughly 120 kilometres. Given that the ADF is unlikely to have chosen to materially downgrade their capabilities by changing out their radars, I think it's safe to assume at least a similarly capable range for the COPS. As mentioned, the radar would be the ship's primary sensor, though other sensors, including integrated IR and electro-optical sights, could likely be integrated at the level of specific weapons systems, which we'll get into later. For underwater sensing, a modern towed array sonar is, of course, essential for an ASW vessel, and a bow-mounted sonar, while less valuable for ASW operations, is still useful for general navigation and collision avoidance, and may be applicable in minesweeping operations. Sonar is another area where Australia can produce competitive systems, and for an emergency vessel like this one, domestic sources would definitely be preferred. Ultramaritime, which currently manage and supply the bow and towed array sonar systems on the Hobart-class air warfare destroyers, would be an obvious place to look, especially given that their Sea Lancer system can be containerized and would not necessarily need to be fully integrated into the vessel if it were simpler or cheaper to not do that. However, other local players, including Thales Underwater, Sonartech Atlas and Acacia, could also be tapped for very capable sonar systems, with priority potentially just given to whoever can best guarantee quick and reliable delivery. Obviously, all of this information would be routed through RAN's near ubiquitous Saab 9LV combat system to simplify the process of transferring personnel between different ship classes. With the integration of standard systems like a commercial navigational radar, this would give the ship a decently capable sensor suite. Hardly world-leading, but sufficient for the roles we need it to play. I thought quite a bit about whether a modern Bathurst could get away without necessarily needing a helicopter. On the one hand, a helicopter is enormously valuable for a surface combatant, especially one focused on ASW, to the point where this kind of shouldn't even be a debate. They drop sonobuoys, they contribute dipping sonar, and they can directly prosecute identified targets at ranges vastly further away than any VLS-launched ASROC, for example, certainly any ship-launched torpedo. Not to mention the other things a helicopter can do, like providing organic over-the-horizon intelligence, attacking surface targets, or quickly transferring crew, critical supplies, and a hell of a lot more. However, they also add plenty of requirements to the base hull. A fully integrated helicopter, one that's expected to perform over weeks at sea, can't simply be strapped to a helipad. It needs a hangar, a refueling system, space for stores and spares, hotel capacity for the crew and maintainers, all of which takes up space, adds weight, and limits the available deck space. And that's before considering the impacts of all that on the size, cost, and complexity of a vessel that is meant to be as cheap and quick to procure as possible. And the challenges of acquiring and crewing helicopters for a ship that's meant to be procured in significant numbers should not be underestimated either. Ultimately, at the end of the day, a vessel like this one, something geared towards anti-submarine warfare, really should have a helicopter embarked. The flexibility they add is enormous, and while there are plenty of examples of modern corvettes which lack helicopter hangars, even capable anti-submarine platforms like the Swedish Visby class, these tend to be smaller ships, optimized for operations fairly close to home, in shallow or enclosed seaways like the Baltic. Australia, given the nature of its geography and the missions that we'll be asking these ships to undertake, doesn't really have that luxury. Carrying a helicopter on a ship, though, imposes some serious demands, most notably scale. If we want endurance, aviation, and a meaningful armament, which we'll cover next, there's not much you can do to get around the fact that you're probably talking about a fairly large ship. While it's hardly a hard rule, roughly 2,500 to 3,000 tons of displacement seems to be about where broadly capable ships start if you want an integrated helicopter hangar. There are exceptions, of course, some of which we'll discuss later, but generally speaking, we probably have to assume a decently large ship. So, with sensors in place and a helicopter on the deck, we come to the part of this video that is probably going to generate the most controversy: armament. So as not to bury the lead, let's get the major piece out early. I don't think that a modern Bathurst needs to be equipped with any Mark 41 VLS cells at all. Now, in a hypothetical video by a nobody like me, I can make that comment and no one really cares. But I'm fully aware that if this were ever announced in the real world by a government or someone with any kind of power, there would probably be an uproar. For many people, the VLS count of a ship is essentially shorthand for its value as a modern combatant. And that's not a completely unreasonable position to take. Every 8-cell Mark 41 module loaded onto a given ship adds enormous potency, flexibility, and inherent modularity. Depending on the missiles you load into it and the sensors you pair it with, they can give a ship surface strike options, air defense or anti-submarine capability, land attack, even anti-satellite and ballistic missile defense capabilities. Why wouldn't we want to install these things onto a modern Bathurst? Well, before we get too far into this part of the video, it's worth reiterating what it is that we're trying to produce here. A cheap, light ship designed for low-intensity missions. Escorts well away from the likely major combat zones, port defense, or operations in the littorals where ground-based air cover may well be present. In other words, just in case the sensor suites that we discussed earlier didn't make it clear, this is not a vessel that's going to be designed for high-end air warfare. And once you take area air defense out of the equation, the case for the Mark 41 becomes a bit of a harder sell. Each 8-cell module weighs roughly 14 tons empty, and costs on the order of around 20 million bucks a piece. Each missile fired out of one of these cells, depending on the missile, can cost anything from about 2 million for an ESSM to over 6 million for an SM-6. And that's before taking any account of the other systems that are required to make best use of this system, like expensive high-end radars such as the CFAR-2 and potentially missile illuminators. Additionally, neither Mark 41 cells nor any of the missiles that fill them are manufactured domestically in Australia, and there is already today a substantial backlog of orders for these systems, and demand for them will, without doubt, swell faster than perhaps any other system in the event of a major naval war breaking out, or even just looming. Now, limitations of the Mark 41 aside, I'm not saying that the ship should have no anti-air capabilities. In the modern battlefield, drones of all types have become ubiquitous, and armed drones, whether that be the small commercial models dropping grenades into trenches or the large Shahed-style kamikaze drones flying hundreds of kilometers to hit Ukrainian hospitals, are likely to be a threat that remains on the battlefield effectively for as long as humans continue to fight. Subsonic anti-ship cruise missiles and maritime strike drones are also proliferating, as we're seeing in the Red Sea. But in the modern day, most of these threats can be countered by means other than expensive surface-to-air interceptor missiles. Smaller drones are vulnerable to electronic warfare and potentially in the future to directed energy weapons serving as dazzlers and even hard kill solutions. Larger drones and subsonic cruise missiles can be countered with naval guns using specialized ammunition and by close-in weapon systems. And if missile-based air defenses are ultimately determined to be absolutely necessary for a particular mission, containerized solutions exist and will be an option that we'll go into later. So, if fully integrated Mark 41s are off the table, what do we arm the ship with? Well, to start with, guns. Lots of guns. Naval guns are often considered as little more than an afterthought in modern vessels, but as discussed above, almost all guns are dual use these days, with anti-air as an important secondary role for guns of almost all calibers. The US Navy, for example, has made extensive use of the 5-inch guns on their Arleigh Burke destroyers to intercept drones fired by Houthi rebels in Yemen as they attempt to interdict shipping through the Red Sea. That same 5-inch gun is fairly ubiquitous in the modern RAN, and would probably be a perfectly good choice here, but it is rather large for the kind of ship we're talking about. Two smaller caliber guns dominate in the market for main guns on small ships today, the Otto Malera 76mm and the BAE Bofors 57mm. Both are roughly the same weight empty, and both are widely adopted around the world, and while neither is currently operated by Australia, the 76mm was formerly in RAN service aboard the Adelaide-class frigates. The 76mm is, fairly obviously, the larger caliber of the two, and that comes with some advantages, particularly in range, and especially when using specialist ammunition. In addition to the standard programmable fused shells, which have become more or less standard over the past few decades, the 76mm boasts two particularly interesting shell types. The 76mm Volcano round is a scaled-down version of the 5-inch Volcano guided projectile, which uses inertial navigation and GPS to guide a specially designed shell over extreme distances, with a claimed range of 40 kilometers. This is an impressive capability, but for a weapon primarily being equipped for air defense, not necessarily a particularly useful one for the modern Bathurst in most contexts. The dart round, however, is an entirely different beast. Widely considered to be among the best gun-based missile interception capabilities on the market today, DART is a guided projectile with radio controls and a proximity fuse. DART is fired at roughly 1200 meters per second and is capable of intercepting missiles out to about 15 kilometers and potentially beyond. The projectile is guided by the ship's onboard radar and can perform maneuvers of up to 40 G, using a pair of small wings. Interceptions are believed to be possible as low as a meter or two above sea level, and this capability has been demonstrated by the Italian Navy in the Red Sea. On the other side of the equation, the Bofors 57mm Mark III lacks a widely available equivalent to DART at this time, but it still has a number of advantages over the 76mm. Rate of fire is significantly better, and critically, speed of traverse and elevation are much better in the 57mm relative to the 76, making it more responsive to fast or maneuvering targets at short range. The smaller caliber ammunition also allows more to be stored in the gun itself, which can hold up to 1,000 6.5 kilogram rounds. Missile interceptions are currently undertaken using the Fuse 3P ammunition from BAE Systems, where the 3P stands for Pre-Fragmented, Programmable, Proximity Fused. Control over detonation is selected by the operator to give each round a specific mission, but for air defense purposes, the shell effectively detonates in proximity to the threat and produces a wall of pellets and shrapnel that covers up to about 400 square meters, making it very challenging for a missile to penetrate intact. While this ammunition is competent, one additional advantage for the 57mm is its recent adoption by the US Navy for their littoral combat ships and their Coast Guard cutters, as well as their forthcoming Constellation frigates. With US adoption comes US R&D money, and potential equivalents to the 76mm DART round have been coming ever since. The first contender was BAE Systems' Ordnance for Rapid Kill of Attack Craft, or ORCA, in 2015. The round retained the 3P's 6 programmable fusing modes, and was steered by 4 folding canards, utilizing a semi-active imaging seeker based on either laser guidance or autonomous seeking against an image of the target uploaded immediately before firing. ORCA claimed an effective range out to roughly 10 kilometers and also claimed a one-shot, one-kill capacity for both airborne targets and small boats, which are often too robust for the traditional 3P projectiles, at least at this caliber. The US Navy ultimately did not select ORCA, but rather placed an order about 3 years later for the Mark 332 Mod 0 high explosive round from L3 Harris, a product of their Advanced Low-Cost Munitions Ordnance, or ALAMO program. The round uses forward-facing sensors to track its target, with adjustments to its flight path made through highly precise explosive ejection of weights, so-called 4-bolt guidance, and is designed to detonate inside the target. This weapon appears to have some limited utility against airborne targets, but is far more focused on the small boat threat. The most advanced guided 57mm munition which was under development was the Multi-Azimuth Defense Fast Intercept Round Engagement System, or MAD-FIRES, from the crazy geniuses at DARPA. The round included a rocket motor to extend range and speed, and was intended specifically to counter the modern missile threat, plausibly including hypersonic missiles. However, no news about the project has been released in some time, and it appears suspended, likely due to what was probably extremely significant cost per round. Whichever gun is ultimately chosen, and either would probably be fine, one slightly unusual proposal I have for this ship would be that it ought to mount more than one of them. The days of multiple gun battleships are long behind us in the 2020s, to the point that it has become almost completely standard for modern ships to have just one large caliber main gun. However, when that gun is also one of your primary air defense weapons, a second example is hardly overkill. In fact, the Italian version of the Frem frigate does exactly this, pairing a 76mm rear-facing gun with a second forward-facing gun of either the same or a larger caliber, depending on the variant. This twin main gun arrangement could then be complemented by a number of other weapons. A pair of smaller caliber guns could be tasked with CIWS duties. This could be the US Phalanx system, the European Millennium gun, or the ship could borrow from the UK's Type 31 and use 40mm Bofors as CIWS. This would be particularly advantageous if the 57mm Bofors were selected as the ship's main gun, as both guns make use of the same 3P programmable proximity fused ammunition. Obviously the calibers aren't interchangeable, but if both guns are making use of the same basic type of ammunition, then the case for domestic manufacturing becomes stronger at both calibers. Anyway, regardless of which specific gun is selected, if arranged carefully, this two main, two secondary arrangement would ensure that no matter the direction of fire, the ship could more or less guarantee that an incoming large drone or subsonic cruise missile would always be within the interception arc of at least two and possibly up to three competent gun systems, which, while hardly world-leading, would likely be a fairly solid defense against the majority of missiles that the ship would be likely to face. As long as salvos aren't too big, then it should be relatively safe in lightly contested environments, especially if supplemented by other systems such as the Nulka missile decoy, another piece of domestic kit that could and probably would be integrated. The US CRAM, rolling airframe missile, is another potential option for the close-in role, and with its longer range and better stopping power, it's in many ways a much better one, but that capability comes at a cost. A 2009 congressional appropriation document pegged the cost of a launcher to the American Navy at $8.4 million per unit. Adjusting that for inflation and converting it to Aussie puts the cost at a hefty $20 million. And that's before you account for the premium for export, the cost to install the launcher, and the cost to load it with 11 missiles, each of which costs well over $1 million. It really wouldn't be hard to see two of these systems adding on the order of about $100 million to the base cost of the ship, too high to justify for the kind of vessel that we're proposing here. Rounding out the defensive systems would be remote weapon stations, probably provided by the Australian company EOS. EOS are well known for their Slinger anti-drone system, but they also do various kinds of defensive systems, from traditional RWSs to electronic warfare and directed energy weapons, including those specifically designed for naval applications. A decent number of RWS and related systems to provide defense against small drones would round out and supplement the ship's other gun-based defenses, and give commanders a range of options for just about any threat. Before we move on, I feel like I should make one point explicit here. In giving up on any Mark 41 VLS systems and excluding long-range air search radars from the sensor suite, we are effectively designing a ship which is not capable of area air defense, at least not without additional modular capabilities, which we'll discuss later. Now, that's not to say that it couldn't provide limited air defense. For example, in a tight escort formation for a small number of landing ships bouncing around between islands, capable guns like the Ottomilera 76mm and its dart munition could probably provide sufficient protection against a handful of missiles or Shahed-style drones fired from a lightly defended hostile shore. The same probably can't be said if we ask the same ship to defend multiple bulk carriers with hundreds of thousands of tons of diesel on board against a concerted air assault from long-range maritime bombers like the Chinese H-6. In arming the modern Bathurst this way, we are effectively limiting its operating areas to those where the air threat is not going to be particularly substantial. Now, there are still plenty of useful theatres for a ship within those limitations. The Western Indian Ocean and Southern Pacific being the most prominent, as well as any areas where area air defense can be provided by another ship or a land-based system, but it will still be restricted in important ways. It's simply an unavoidable consequence of the ship type under discussion here. Air defense is expensive, and this ship isn't. Moving on to anti-surface firepower, the vessel's capabilities would depend on the threat it was looking to counter, and those threats, to a vessel like the modern Bathurst, will likely come in two distinct classes. First, and in many ways the most dangerous and most likely, are small surface targets which mostly pose a threat at very short ranges. These will include the kind of remotely operated surface drones that have proven their value against Russian forces in the Black Sea, as well as more traditional small threats like fast attack boats, which have long been recognized as a significant threat in enclosed waterways, best represented by the Iranian Navy and Revolutionary Guard Corps in the Red Sea. The Ukrainian Navy's use of their Sea Baby and other drones against the Russian fleet has provided very valuable real-world evidence regarding the best ways to both employ and to counter these weapon systems. They present a wicked problem of detection, targeting, and destruction. Even the larger versions sit very low in the water, making detection challenging, and newer generations are functionally underwater drones with just sensors and communications equipment poking out above the water. Even once detected, maintaining the track is likely to be challenging. Russian success at intercepting and tracking the drones with helicopters has been partially countered by equipping them with light anti-air missiles, which, as of January 2025, have claimed their first Russian helicopter kill. Once detected, electronic warfare to interrupt their communications is likely to be a first step, but future generations of these weapons will likely be at least semi-autonomous, making jamming less effective than it may be today. At that point, kinetic strike is about the only option available. Given their rapidly evolving nature, the only realistic option in terms of armaments to defeat the threat of surface drones is probably diversity. The ship's guns will be a first-choice weapon and likely continue to be into the future. Shallow subsurface threats, for example, might be countered by shells designed to burst immediately after they hit the water, acting as a sort of very shallow depth charge. And direct fire from the ship's remote weapon stations and 30 or 40mm turrets could also be employed. But other options should also be considered. The US Navy, for example, uses vertically launched longbow Hellfire missiles on their littoral combat ships, at least the Surface Warfare Mission module. While the LCS has been heavily criticized over the years, and not unfairly, this capability shouldn't be underestimated. With a range of roughly 8 kilometers, the surface-launched Hellfire offers radar-guided precision and would give the ship enormous anti-swarm capabilities for only minor space and weight considerations. Plus, given that the missile is currently in service with the ADF, albeit in a helicopter launch variety, acquisition would probably be relatively simple. The other class of surface threats to the modern Bathurst would be the traditional surface combatants of hostile navies, which modern ships can technically deal with using a variety of different weapons, but practically speaking are almost exclusively going to be attacked using anti-ship cruise missiles at standoff ranges. The obvious first option here is to equip the ship with the same capable, modern anti-ship cruise missile which is becoming standard for the RAN, the Kongsberg-designed naval strike missile. This missile uses its stealthy design to slow detection from hostile forces, improving its probability of penetrating even relatively modern air defenses. Though it only packs a relatively small 125kg warhead, its advanced imaging infrared seeker is designed to facilitate pinpoint strikes, meaning that every hit should be at a critical point with a high chance of disabling or mission-killing a ship, even if it can't put that ship on the bottom. The NSM is a perfectly adequate missile for Australia's major surface combatants, and equipping it to a modern Bathurst would make sense, especially given that both the missile and the launcher are set to be manufactured domestically in Australia before the end of the decade. For all of these reasons, the NSM makes sense and would probably end up on the modern Bathurst. However, there is a problem with applying the NSM to a ship of this type. The modern Bathurst would probably have two situations where it might be called upon to fire its ASCMs. First, it might be tasked to serve as a shooter within a broader battle network, firing its missiles effectively blindly at coordinates provided by a separate sensor, then turning around and getting out of there before hostile fire can come back to it. Alternatively, it might find itself engaged by a hostile surface ship, though that would require that ship to slip undetected through airborne and spaceborne sensors and get within firing range of the Bathurst. In either scenario, the modern Bathurst is put at substantial risk of facing return fire. China's most prolific ASCM is the YJ-83, which has a range very comparable to the NSM, with a base model for both weapons declaring a range of, quote, more than 185 kilometers. That said, it's not clear how much more or whether that number refers to an air-launched or a surface-launched missile, or, for that matter, how trustworthy the numbers are, given that both sides have an interest in hiding their true capabilities. The YJ-83 lacks the NSM stealth, but it does use a supersonic terminal boost stage to avoid interception and improve its odds of impacting, and it boasts a warhead of between 165 and 190 kilograms, likely more than enough to mission kill a ship like the modern Bathurst, even if it doesn't sink it. However, while the two missiles do seem comparable, as we discussed above, the ship we're designing here is not optimized for air defense, lacking the large powerful radars and surface-to-air missile cells which would be required to stand a decent chance of intercepting those hostile missiles reliably. Its guns and seaward systems would do their best and could very possibly do enough against a small volley, but an 8-cell barrage that something like a Type 54 frigate could put out would almost certainly result in multiple hits and a destroyed ship. And short of redesigning the vessel into a capable air defense asset, which would largely defeat the purpose of a small, cheap, simple ship, there's no obvious solution there. If a modern Bathurst and a hostile Chinese ship get into a one-on-one fight, assuming both ships are aware of one another, the Bathurst will lose almost every time, even if it does have a decent chance of taking down its opponent with it. Similarly, if a Bathurst is forced to close to within YJ-83 range of, say, a carrier battle group to serve its role as a shooter within an A2AD complex, it is very likely to find itself on the receiving end of a substantial volley of YJ-83s, or even the significantly nastier, longer range, supersonic YJ-12s. So, what's the alternative? Well, rather than improving the modern Bathurst's air defense, we could equip it with a longer range missile to keep it out of range of return fire. The obvious candidate here is the Long Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM. The American-designed LRASM is a JASSM derivative which, like the NSM, uses stealth and advanced passive sensors to provide a high degree of survivability against hostile air defenses, but which is substantially larger and longer ranged than its Norwegian cousin, with a declared range of greater than 200 nautical miles or 370 kilometers, and scope to increase that range with later variants. Though originally designed as an air-launched weapon, Lockheed Martin and Thales Australia announced in 2021 a plan to develop a surface-launched variant specifically for the ADF, using a Mark 114 jettisonable rocket booster to get the weapon up to altitude after a surface launch. The weapon was originally intended for the Mark 41 VLS system, but could very likely be deployed in box launchers instead. LRASM would, at least in some cases, allow the modern Bathurst to outrange many of its potential opponents, giving it the ability to strike without necessarily putting itself in danger. It wouldn't be a panacea, of course. For one, limited air defense capabilities would still leave the modern Bathurst vulnerable to air-launched cruise missile attacks, and longer-ranged weapons or anti-ship ballistic missiles would still pose a massive threat. If those expensive, exquisite weapons ever get targeted as something as small and low threat as a modern Bathurst would likely be perceived to be. And, of course, all the range in the world is of no particular value if you can't identify your opposition until they close the distance and bring themselves into range as well. It may well be that the logistical benefits of the locally manufactured NSM win out, especially given that the modern Bathurst would not really be designed to take on hostile surface ships all that often. But the advantages of the LRASM to this specific platform should not be underestimated, and it should definitely be considered. Finally, anti-submarine weapons need to be considered as well, but this section will be fairly brief. Without any integrated Mark 41 cells for ASROC or similar weapons, the only long-range ASW armament that the vessel has will be lightweight torpedoes deployed from its integrated helicopter. However, Mark 32 triple torpedo tubes could also be employed. These launchers only weigh roughly a ton each and can be simply mounted to the deck with little to no penetration. Given their low weight and ease of installation, a pair of these launchers to serve as last-ditch short-range ASW weapons should be a fairly low-cost addition. Thinking about the missions that a modern Bathurst might be called upon to do, giving it other systems would likely be extremely valuable, but also difficult to justify for the base hull, given the directive to keep costs low. One domestic system that would almost certainly get a Guernsey would be the Nulka decoy, which we briefly mentioned earlier. Nulka is a hovering rocket with sophisticated electronics designed to entice anti-ship cruise missiles away from the ship that launched it. This is one of Australia's most successful defence exports, having been adopted not only by the RAN, but also by the US and Canadian navies. Other systems, such as sophisticated electronic warfare or directed energy weapons, are available, and are even available from Australian companies like EOS, but they all add cost and complexity when integrated into the base hull. So while a sophisticated SIGINT or EW suite or mine-laying gear would undoubtedly be appreciated, it probably needs to be relegated to a modular add-on that can be put in or left out as the situation demands. A mission bay would therefore be considered highly valuable, though technically not essential for a ship like this. If such a bay is implemented, the obvious system to use there would be the UK's Persistent Operational Deployment System, or PODS, which is being implemented on the Royal Navy's Type 26 frigate and therefore presumably on the RAN's Hunter class, which is a Type 26 derivative. PODS standardizes power, data, HVAC, and cooling water connections interfaces, and is intended for everything from simple storage for ammunition to directly deployable mines or unmanned air, surface, and subsurface systems, to additional sensors, kinetic and energy-based weapons, and more. Obviously, the potential for flexibility here is enormous, and this would represent an equally enormous increase to potential capabilities of the ship without necessarily blowing the budget. A central store of high-end containerized systems, say EW or directed energy weapons, could be established in Australia and equipped only on vessels being deployed to areas or on missions where those capabilities make sense. In lower threat environments, the mission bay could simply store ammunition or other supplies, or just be left empty to reduce weight. Another modular add-on, which probably needs to be integrated as early as possible, is the Mark 70 containerized VLS. Originally designed for land warfare and only recently brought into naval service, the Mark 70 does basically what it says on the tin. It puts a 4-cell VLS module into an ISO standard cargo container. The cells are horizontal when stowed and raise up to vertical when ready to fire. This does point to some of the weaknesses of the system. They are likely too top-heavy to leave in place 100% of the time, especially in rough seas, and the opening and deployment process takes the kind of time that is generally not available when they're most needed. But, despite these limitations, the US Navy has recently announced their intention to deploy the system aboard their littoral combat ships, placing them on the vessel's helipads. This will cost the ship their ability to undertake air operations, but repays that sacrifice by giving up to 12 or maybe even more VLS cells to the notoriously undergunned LCS, allowing them to take on roles from long-range strike to air defense. Now, earlier in this video, I made quite the point about not implementing Mark 41 VLS on these vessels, and as fully integrated parts of the ship, I stand by that. The additional cost and delays associated with joining the queue for those cells is just not justifiable for a capability that the ship simply won't need on 90% of its missions. However, as a modular capability, Mark 70 VLS can be assumed in the design from day one, but don't necessarily need to actually be there before the ship's launch to still allow them to perform important missions. Moreover, since many missions wouldn't require the Mark 70s to be installed, the number of systems acquired could be much lower than what would be required to fully equip the entire fleet. Assuming that, say, 2 out of 3 ships are available at any given time, and of those 2/3, the majority are operating without the need for significant area air defense in convoy escort roles far from the front lines, for example, then acquiring sufficient Mark 70s to equip 1 in 5 or at most 1 in 4 ships would likely be sufficient, costing significantly less and reducing demand on US production lines for the launch cells. In some ways, assuming Mark 70s during the design phase is an expression of the much maligned designed for but not with philosophy that dominated in the 1990s and early 2000s. But in this case, adding the capability in down the line doesn't require major refits or costs. Acquiring a handful of these systems for the modern Bathursts would allow them to participate in a wider variety of missions and operate in higher threat environments. For example, a modern Bathurst escorting a convoy of diesel tankers through the Western Indian Ocean probably has relatively little to fear from air threats, and will instead be regularly using its helipad and helicopter to undertake ASW sweeps. But if it were instead escorting a convoy of medium landing craft to a beach where there is a known high level of threat from both manpads and ground-launched ASCMs, helicopter operations might well be restricted or even disallowed given the risk involved. In that situation, sacrificing the helipad for a couple of Mark 70s filled with enough ESSMs to provide limited medium-range area air defense would be an excellent trade. Alternately, the Mark 70 might not be involved in air warfare at all. For example, if wartime attrition, maintenance availability, or some other factor meant that an ASW-focused modern Bathurst was forced to deploy without a Seahawk helicopter to assist it in finding and prosecuting hostile submarines, a couple of ASROC-armed Mark 70s might give the ship back some of the anti-submarine standoff range that it lost when it lost its helicopter. The Mark 70 is probably even more useful than the pod system described earlier, if for no other reason than that it needs no mission bay or other implementation within the design of the ship itself. These can quite literally be bolted to the helideck and basically be ready to go, once they're tied into the ship's sensors. With price an ever-present consideration, this level of platform agnosticism is quite valuable. So, to summarise, what have we designed with the modern Bathurst? Well, it's a ship optimised for convoy escort, specifically anti-submarine escort, and low-end duties in relatively low air threat environments. To undertake the ASW mission, it needs a helicopter, which probably puts the overall vessel at least somewhere around the 2,000 ton range, and maybe a little bigger. It's slow, cruising at 15 knots and peaking in the low 20s, but hopefully fairly efficient and as quiet as we can make it without spending too much money. For sensors, we've gone as Australian as possible, with the COPS and CTAC radars providing medium-range air search capabilities, and with the locally provided hull-mounted and towed array sonar offering ASW sensors to complement the dipping sonar on the helicopter. When it comes to armaments, we've skimped on anti-air and splurged on anti-surface, with a pair of 76 or 57mm main guns complemented by at least a pair of 30 to 40mm secondary guns arranged around the ship so that no matter what direction an air threat is coming from, at least 2 or 3 large guns will be able to target it with modern, highly capable ammunition. These guns will be supplemented by 2 or more remote weapon stations, and air defense will be bolstered by the inclusion of the Nulka decoy system and, if and when the mission requires it, Mark 70 containerized VLS. Anti-surface armament, in addition to the guns, will consist of a small battery of VLS Hellfire missiles for precise anti-swarm strikes at range, and long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, ideally the LRASM, but the NSM if required. Finally, a pair of Mark 32 triple torpedo launchers round out the armament, though most anti-submarine strikes would be carried out by a helicopter. Space can, ideally, be allocated for modular systems, potentially in the form of a mission bay designed for the pod system, which will be used on the Hunter-class frigates, as well as the aforementioned Mark 70s bolted onto the hull, though these may need to be utilised from the heli deck if air defence were considered more critical than ASW operations for any given mission. So, with the basic requirements established, let's talk about how we could put this together in an Australian industrial context. It is that context which places the most significant restrictions on the design and size of the ship. Assuming that the modern Bathurst will not be allowed to displace existing, ongoing shipbuilding efforts underway at Henderson in WA, specifically at the CivMec facility, and Osborne in South Australia, then there are basically only 2 other Australian shipyards capable of producing ships at any meaningful scale. The first is the Austal facility at Henderson, which is distinct from the CivMec facility where the general purpose frigates and other large ships are currently proposed to be built. The Austal yard currently produces the relatively small Guardian and Evolved Cape class vessels for the Australian government, though these programs could easily be suspended in a high enough threat environment. Though those 2 vessels are relatively small, Austal's facilities appear to have the capability to go quite a bit bigger. They have 4 bays available, varying from 93 to 99 metres long and from 21 to 35 metres wide. The facility also has a 2,000 ton slipway, which we can probably assume to be the upper limit for the launch weight of any ships built at the facility. The second major Australian shipbuilding facility, which might potentially become available in a wartime contingency, is the Incat shipyard in Tasmania, which makes principally catamaran-style ferries and other large vessels. While several vessels manufactured by Incat have seen military service for Australia and the US, Incat is primarily a civilian manufacturer, but with a significantly larger size cap on its capabilities as compared with Austal. Incat's largest vessels have been 130 metres long and displaced well over 10,000 tons. In an emergency scenario, be it wartime or preparations for a war that the government is confident is coming, INCAT's facilities could probably be converted to the production of military vessels relatively quickly, particularly if the selected vessel was chosen to play to their strengths. Unfortunately, other shipyards, such as Burden's Port Macquarie facility, are probably too small to produce a ship of the scale that we're talking about with a modern Bathurst. So, on the question of scale, how big would a modern Bathurst actually need to be? Well, that's a difficult question because there really isn't a precise, direct analogue to the ship out there, at least that I've been able to find. But there are a couple of comparable vessels, with the closest being the Holland-class OPV, in service with the Royal Netherlands Navy. The Holland-class is a 3,750-ton, diesel-powered, ocean-going patrol vessel with a top speed of just over 20 knots and a 5,000 nautical mile unrefueled range. It boasts a helicopter hangar, decent but unspectacular radar capabilities, and is armed with 76 and 30mm Otto Malera guns, as well as a few smaller caliber weapons. Overall, it's very close to the modern Bathurst concept, lacking only some additional guns to beef up its air defense, some anti-surface missiles, and sonars and torpedo launchers to take on ASW duties, all of which would add to the weight and cost of the vessel, but all of which should be achievable, at least in theory. Unfortunately, the Holland class is just over 108 metres long and 16 metres wide, which, combined with its displacement and steel hull, probably puts the class outside the capabilities of the Austral yards, at least without significant expansion work. Potentially, a smaller vessel of the ship might be able to achieve similar capabilities, but if not, we'll probably need to find an alternative analogue. When looking for that analogue, one potential option is to go back and consider the ships which have already been built at the Austral facility. The Guardian and Evolved Cape class, which are being built there at the moment, don't really offer us much. Neither have the capacity to meaningfully contribute in a modern war, even at the limited level that's being proposed here for the modern Bathurst. And even the big brothers of the Evolved Capes, Austral's various steel-hulled OPV-60 concepts, would struggle to offer meaningful capability value in a high-end fight. The company splits them up into 3 variants, and while each one could potentially provide some value, none can offer even close to a full package. The maritime security variant, for example, mounts a 40mm cannon, but seems to lack the sensors to do much with it. The surveillance variant has an air search radar but is functionally unarmed. The subsurface warfare variants boast a tow-to-raid sonar, but not the armaments to prosecute a detected target, nor a helicopter capability to pass targets off to. These ships could probably complement larger and more capable vessels, but they certainly can't replace them. Austral have, however, built a more interesting vessel at Henderson, but not for Australia. In 2014, Austral won a contract from the Navy of Oman to deliver a pair of what they called high-speed support vessels. These 72-metre long, diesel-fueled aluminium catamarans were lightly equipped, with just a single 20mm naval gun, supplemented by up to 4 12.7mm general-purpose machine guns, and an electro-optical surveillance system to identify threats and provide targeting data. The vessel had no hangar, but does have a helipad, and a large bay beneath that helipad with 158 lane meters of storage for vehicles. The vessel has a crew of 69 and a maximum speed of 35 knots, with a 2,150 nautical mile range at a more economical 12.5 knots, and 7 days endurance. At first glance, this vessel doesn't seem to have much to do with the described modern Bathurst, but Austral have designed 2 variants which offer much more relevant capabilities, the HSSV-92 and HSSV 113. The smaller, 92-metre-long vessel includes significantly improved armaments, with a main cannon of 57 to 76mm and with the four 12.7mm remote weapon stations upgraded to 30mm cannons. Similar improvements can be seen across the board. 7 days endurance increased to 10, 2,150 nautical mile range increased to 3,500, significant growth in the scale of the flight bay and the vehicle deck, and an improved deadweight capacity of just over 500 tons. Two major improvements take the 92 into a different category to the 72, however, and make it far more relevant for the modern Bathurst role. The first is sensors. The company doesn't directly lay out its sensors, but renders of the HSSV 92 show the same masts as on the larger model, and those sensors are detailed. These vessels will include a 2D surveillance radar, fire control directors, a radar electronic support measure, or ESM, for electronic intelligence and related data gathering, as well as general situational awareness, a significantly more capable set of sensors than is found in the Omani model. The second major change, and probably the more significant one, is the addition of a helicopter hangar, which takes advantage of the significant width that the catamaran hull form offers to store up to 2 Seahawk-sized helicopters. While the 72-metre version does have a substantial helipad, it doesn't include a hangar, putting long-term helicopter operations out of the question, but this is not the case for the two larger variants. This makes the larger HSSVs potentially quite capable as ASW assets, even if no other modifications are made. Add in those modifications, and we could find ourselves with a very capable vessel. To round out these variants, the HSSV 113 offers 14 days of endurance, 4,000 nautical miles of range, and 575 deadweight tons of carrying capacity. Armaments are further improved versus the 92-metre variant through the addition of a CIWS integrated over the hangar and 8 surface-to-surface anti-ship cruise missiles mounted in box launchers behind the mast, as well as a pair of decoy launchers. These vessels, particularly the 113, come very close to meeting the basic criteria of the modern Bathurst. They are Australian designed and could be built locally. They have sufficient range and endurance to be useful, and they have, or could be fairly easily equipped with, a suitable armament and sensor package. They carry helicopters and have an enormous amount of helipad space, sufficient for a Chinook in fact, and more than sufficient for modular systems on the deck like the Mark 70 launcher. The vehicle deck could be trivially modified into a mission bay, allowing for modular systems to be implemented, including things like a towed array sonar. The mission bay may even be able to retain its utility as a vehicle deck, with ro-ro capabilities, allowing the Corvettes to serve double duty as fast transports when needed. The CIWS above the hangar could be converted to a second main caliber gun, exactly as it is in the Italian FREM. The Hellfire missile launchers and torpedo launchers are admittedly missing, but both could plausibly be added fairly easily given their small footprints. Consider the picture here from the USS Indianapolis, an Independence-class LCS, showing a 12-cell Hellfire launcher compared with a sailor working on it. Structurally appropriate space for a system that size is likely not going to be too challenging to find. Despite those advantages, though, there are at least 3 major challenges with proposing these vessels to fill the modern Bathurst niche. The first is simply the size of the vessel. The 113-metre ship is, at least on paper, far more capable and a better fit for what the modern Bathurst would be needed to do, so that really should be our baseline. Assuming that we have full access to both Austal and Incat's yards with no minor war vessel or civilian work going on, then in theory, Incat could probably have up to about 6 of these vessels in production simultaneously, at least once their recently announced expansion is completed. Though that number might be optimistic, so let's say 4 for conservatism's sake. At Austal, however, based on the published data about the size of their current sheds, they probably wouldn't be able to produce the 113-metre long ship at all. It's over 14 metres longer than their longest bays. Although not confirmed, that might actually be why the 92-metre concept exists in the first place. It's possible that it was designed specifically to be the largest ship that could be built in Henderson. Even assuming that there is sufficient space available to lengthen the sheds, which is not guaranteed, both the 113 and 92-metre long ships will still only fit in 2 of the bays due to their beam, or their width. This will limit the ability to produce those ships in large numbers, and may warrant either a redesign, which is far from ideal, or potentially production of both the larger and the smaller variant, which would increase numbers, but limit the capabilities of the smaller ships and eliminate the benefit of a single consistent design. The second issue that I see is the carrying capacity of the vessels. At a deadweight capacity of 575 tonnes, the HSSV 113 is quite limited, a common problem with catamaran-type hulls. By way of comparison, an Anzac frigate has a deadweight of around 600 to 700 tonnes, and notoriously that class has weight issues with the equipment which has been loaded onto the hull over the years. Once the HSSV is converted into a modern Bathurst, and in the process is upgunned, new sensors are added, a helicopter is landed, and fuel, crew, ammunition and stores are loaded on, particularly if modifications are made to allow for an endurance of beyond 14 days, then the margin for modular systems is likely to get fairly tight. And this problem will only be made worse with a smaller variant, which may be required if we want to fit it into the Austral sheds. There doesn't really seem to be much to be done about this issue, however, and it may simply be a limitation that we just have to accept if this is the hull form that we ultimately have to use. The third and largest issue, though, is one of simple suitability for the role. It's all good and well to look at a concept design for a ship, count weapon systems, look at range and endurance figures, and tick boxes on a checklist. But at the end of the day, no matter how it looks on paper, a ship has to perform in the real world. And there are undeniable real-world challenges to taking an aluminium catamaran built for speed and putting it into the role of a warship designed for slow, long-endurance escorts and ASW missions on the open ocean. To begin with, it's not clear whether the catamaran hull will be ideal for ASW. Some sources, including the ever-reliable ChatGPT, claim that turbulent water flow and associated hydrodynamic noise can occur, but there seems to be limited backing for this claim, at least in the public domain. Certainly, highly specialized sonar ships for large-scale ocean surveillance do use catamaran hulls, though generally the swath design, and these large-scale systems, like the American SIRTAS system, are quite different to a more typical ASW towed array. Regardless, it is certainly true that catamarans are not commonly employed as warships, and even less commonly as general-purpose warships, typically restricted to small, high-speed coastal vessels like the Norwegian Charles class or the Taiwanese Tuao Chang, which make best use of the advantages of twin hulls while limiting their exposure to their inherent weaknesses. A small, fast coastal ship is a pretty far cry from what we're designing here, so it's unlikely to be optimal, even if specifically ASW isn't the problem that AI seems to think it will be. Second, aluminium as a building material for a warship is not ideal for a variety of reasons. A big one is its melting temperature. Aluminium melts at 660 degrees, less than half the melting point of steel, making the risk of structural failure in the event of a fire far more significant than would be the case on a steel ship. Moreover, while aluminium is stronger than steel relative to its weight, overall strength is lower, and this can cause issues for vessels deployed in rough seas. The US Navy currently operates 2 Austral aluminium ships, the twin-hulled Spearhead expeditionary fast transports, which basically use the same hull form as the HSSV, and the Trimaran Independence class of littoral combat ships. Both classes have experienced cracking as a result of operations at high speed in rough seas, and it's entirely plausible, if not probable, that similar issues would be seen with a modern Bathurst made of aluminium. The biggest issue by far, though, is one of stability. Catamaran hulls are not widely used in the open ocean because they do not perform well in rough conditions, and while they are in theory more stable in gentle sea states, once their stability is broken by rough weather, it tends to break hard. These vessels can tip, and unlike in a monohull, a tip is generally not recoverable. These issues can be partially offset by small waterplane area twin hull, or swath designs, which improve stability by placing more mass underneath the waterline. But the HSSV, like all of Austal's similar designs, is only semi-swath, and the issue is likely to be exacerbated once additional tonnage is placed high up on the vessel in the form of weapons and helicopters and the like. The US Navy has seen issues with the deployability of their spearhead fast transports due to limitations associated with the vessel's ability to perform in open water and high sea states. Potentially, especially if INCAT were to be involved in the manufacture of these vessels, the addition of a central wave-piercing bow could be considered, which is a hallmark of INCAT's vessels and which contributes to improved stability in rough seas, but it would represent a fairly major redesign, which may or may not turn out to be viable. These issues are real and they're not insignificant and they shouldn't be ignored. I do recognize that if we're up against a real engineering limitation here, if an aluminium catamaran simply cannot be designed to function effectively in the open Indian and Southern Pacific Oceans, then I'm barking up the wrong tree here in suggesting the HSSV as a potential base design, and we would need to consider an alternate starting vessel. However, I would suggest that there are two factors which need to be taken into consideration before we abandon the HSSV as our baseline. The first is that the learnings from recent challenges with ships like these in naval service could and almost certainly would be employed in the detailed design for any modern Bathurst or other ship for that matter based on the HSSV hull. The cracking issue encountered on the spearhead, for example, has been solved by additional reinforcement, admittedly at a cost of roughly $2 million US per vessel, but integrating that reinforcement into the design would no doubt be significantly cheaper and prevent the issue from happening in the first place. Similarly, the catamaran stability issues will by now have been considered in a fair bit of detail by the US Navy as a result of employing their spearheads, which, while they are intended primarily for intra-theatre operations, do have an open ocean-going capability. Learnings about how best to operate them could very likely be carried over into the RAN if and when the time comes for doctrine development for twin-hulled combat vessels like a HSSV variant modern Bathurst. This might mean significant limitations and could require careful mission planning and timing of convoys to minimize exposure to major weather systems. But even limited in that manner, if the alternative is nothing, then it seems like a positive trade. And on that note, we come to the second major consideration, which is, just like when the original Bathurst was designed in 1938, we are today forced to work with what we have in 2025. The government's recently released Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Plan shows that Australia's large-scale shipyard capacity is largely spoken for over the next few decades, and without much of a large civilian shipbuilding industry, in a wartime scenario, we are going to have to make do with what we have left. And what we have left are 2 yards with decent capacity, both of which just happen to be optimized for the production of aluminium twin-hulled catamarans. It would be an enormous waste of time and resources to take these facilities and retool them for the production of steel monohulls when the entire purpose of a modern Bathurst would be low cost and speed to delivery. And that's before even considering the workforce, which I have admittedly largely ignored as a factor in this video. In wartime, people have a tendency to become available when national survival is at stake. However, even in that scenario, taking the existing skilled workforce and failing to take advantage of their experience by demanding they build something they're not used to would be foolish. I'm sure they would do their best, but inevitably speed and quality would suffer while they relearnt major elements of their profession, and that's a risk we probably wouldn't be in a position to take. At the end of the day, if the warships that can be best and most efficiently produced are twin-hulled aluminium catamarans, assuming that they can be designed to meet the minimum requirements, then that is what we will produce. Because even given how susceptible they might be to damage if they're struck, how limited their deployability might be in truly rough weather, how short their hull lives might turn out to be due to cracking, any capability they provide is better than no capability, which is what we would get if we let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, with all that established, we can at least roughly start to estimate what one of these vessels might cost. Determining the sticker price for these ships could be done in two ways. One would be to estimate the total cost of the various components and develop a bottom-up model, but that's extremely challenging with open source data and prone to compounding errors, so a top-down approach is probably more useful. To do this, I've looked at comparable vessels around the world and tried to place the modern Bathurst on a bit of a cost spectrum. Obviously enough, if we're assuming that the place to start is the Austral HSSV as a baseline, then we can look at the Omani contract for the HSSV 72. Adjusted for inflation and converted to Aussie, the contract that Austral was awarded in 2014 was for the equivalent of about $260 million for two ships, giving us a rough sticker price of about $130 million each for the 72-metre vessel. The 113-metre vessel, which we can take as our baseline, is about 60% longer and 40% wider, so nominally for the hull alone, we can assume those factors, which takes us to about $290 million. But that doesn't account for the significantly more sophisticated weapons, sensors, and other systems which could be expected to add significantly. Let's nominally say around $100 million and assume a rough sticker price of about $400 million for a modern Bathurst. To come at this question from an entirely different direction, we can look at one of the most directly comparable vessels that I've come across to the modern Bathurst concept outlined in this video, that being the Dutch Holland class OPV, which was mentioned earlier in the video. Based on the most recent orders from the Dutch, which can then be adjusted for inflation and converted to Australian dollars, these vessels would be expected to cost on the order of about $300 million each. However, again, we will need to cost in the additional capabilities required to turn these into modern Bathursts. While they are closer than the HSSV 72 was, we can still probably assume a price tag in the Australian service of somewhere around 350 to 400 million. The third and final comparison vessel is the Bulgarian MMPV 90, which was designed by Lursen based on the same hull that was used for the Arafura, but significantly bigger and badder. Despite displacing just 2,300 tons, the MMPV is significantly more capable than even the proposed modern Bathurst, boasting a helicopter hangar, decent radar, hull-mounted sonar, anti-ship cruise missiles, a 76mm main gun, a 35mm Sea-Whiz, torpedo tubes, and an 8-cell European VLS. They have a 24-knot top speed and cost, again, about $400 million, though that does exclude weapons. So it seems likely that we should anticipate a price tag of somewhere around 400 million Aussie for a modern Bathurst, though as with any defence purchase, the risk of a cost blowout is omnipresent. Just ask the Germans, whose Braunschweig-class corvettes have done exactly that. This is a diesel-powered corvette with an undersized hangar, which comes in at just under 2,000 tons of displacement, equips a 76mm Otto Malera main cannon, a pair of 27mm secondary guns, anti-ship missiles, rolling airframe missiles for close-in defense, and integrated mine-laying equipment. Not miles away from a modern Bathurst conceptually, but which has blown out to the equivalent of around 700 million Aussie dollars per hull. Ignoring blowout risk for now, a purchase price of around $400 million seems plausible, though if they were purchased in numbers, that price might be expected to fall over time. The price tag would see the modern Bathurst cost roughly half of what the government's budget allocations seem to suggest they anticipate paying for a general-purpose frigate under Project C3000, and a mere fraction of what the Hunter-class frigates will eventually cost, which might top out somewhere around a truly eye-watering $7 billion apiece. From that perspective, we're getting a bargain. So, to start to wrap things up, the modern Bathurst concept that I've outlined in this video is, in my opinion at least, pretty close to a minimum viable product that could be acquired to do useful work for Australia, given our geography and likely wartime needs. Sure, yeah, there may be corners which could be cut. We could remove a gun or the Hellfire missiles. We could drop down from LRASM to NSM. Maybe we even cut the helicopter, though that would be a hell of a cut. But fundamentally, modern warfare demands a level of capability from surface combatants that warfare in the 40s simply didn't. And the number of sophisticated systems that need to be packed into a modern hull means that there have been size and cost increases for even small vessels when compared against their World War II antecedents. This increased sophistication is a real challenge for the modern Bathurst as a concept, because it inevitably brings with it an unavoidable level of cost. The $400 million price tag we just discussed is very low for a modern warship, but during World War II, an original Bathurst cost the RAN on the order of about $25 million each. And yes, that figure has been adjusted for inflation. Excluding in the unmanned realm, there's just nothing in the modern fleet that even comes close to that cost, while retaining anything like the Bathurst capability set. For comparison, consider the evolved Cape class of today, which is smaller than 1940s era Bathurst and, relative to the ships around it in the modern RAN, is vastly less capable than the Bathurst ever was. But even it costs about $60 million and comes functionally unarmed and not really capable of contributing to a major fight. So we are simply going to have to accept that if we want this vessel, we're going to have to pay for it. And that honestly might be enough to kill the concept entirely. At $25 million a pop, you can afford to build 60 odd World War II era Bathursts, but at $400 million, you can't build a modern Bathurst in the same numbers, and that might mean that the concept simply does not translate to the modern day. It might be that the only ships you can build in those kind of numbers are either single-purpose, very basic missile corvettes, or OPVs designed solely for constabulary, which can't contribute to a major fight. And if that's the case, then the modern Bathurst just isn't going to get off the ground. So that leads to the final question of this video. Do we want a modern Bathurst? I mean, I think that there's certainly the latent industrial capability in Australia to build a decent number of hulls with a significant domestic contribution in the form of major subsystems and armaments, particularly if current civilian yards could be compelled to prioritise defence work in a national security emergency. And we shouldn't underestimate the potential for these ships to be delivered quickly. The original HSSV contract was awarded to Austal in March of 2014, and the first ship was delivered to Oman in just over 2 years, the second just a few months later in September of 2016, basically 2 ships in 2.5 years. Admittedly, the modern Bathurst would be more complex and larger than that vessel was, but there's no reason to assume the timeline would need to blow out massively. a 3-year delivery time should be completely achievable. More than that, there's scope to deliver them in decent numbers. With sufficient demand signalling from the federal government, it's entirely feasible that, assuming we could suspend construction of Evolved Capes and Guardians at Henderson and of civilian ferries in Tassie, we could see these vessels produced in lots of, at a minimum, 4 and potentially as many as around 8 at a time, assuming that space is available in Austal's Henderson facility to quickly extend its sheds, or if parts could be fabricated in Henderson with final assembly taking place in Tassie. Workforce would be a challenge, admittedly, but not an insurmountable one, particularly in a wartime or near wartime scenario, and even more so if export-oriented industries, and I'm thinking here mostly of WA's resources industry, were in a slowdown, which you kind of would expect if Australia and its biggest customer were on the verge of coming to blows. And of course, all of this assumes that the aluminium catamaran hull form can be produced in such a way as to allow it to undertake the missions that we need it to undertake. I do realize there are issues there, but I'm choosing to be optimistic here. If a monohull is required, that's likely to add significantly to design time and work against the natural advantages of the shipyards that we have available, doubly so if a steel monohull is ultimately deemed necessary. So for now, I'm choosing optimism, but I'm fully aware that a proper study by actual experts could wipe all of that away. But all that being said, should we expect there to be demand for a ship of this type in the coming years? Well, honestly, probably not. At least not in the short term. The current government has spent much of their first term establishing the existing shipbuilding plan, which focuses on Project C3000 and the general purpose frigates to fill the looming gap. And I just don't see there being much scope for the government to substantially change course, given the massive investment of time and resources that was put into developing the current plan. Given how tight our time constraints are already, I certainly wouldn't want to see them change horses midstream here. I don't think that we should cancel or otherwise impede the current progress towards the general purpose frigates under C3000 and put those resources into a less capable, cheaper modern Bathurst instead. And even if we did, bringing these vessels forward any quicker than the current general purpose frigates would exacerbate the already tight crewing situation that the peacetime RAN finds itself in. What I would like to see, though, is some acknowledgement from the government that Australia's Navy, while it's on a great trajectory in the long term, has a real issue in the short term. Our major surface combatant force will fall to single digits either this year or next year when we retire our second Anzac-class frigate, and isn't likely to crack 10 again until the middle of the 2030s. That will see us at our absolute weakest in terms of naval hulls during the second half of the 2020s, which is widely forecast as being the era of the most significant risk for conflict in our region. A program like the modern Bathurst could be one way to offset that gap. We don't even necessarily need to build the ship just yet to begin that program. Even a design study could be enormously valuable, particularly if it involved preliminary discussions with both Austal and INCAT, and the refining of the HSSV design according to input from both manufacturers as well as the ADF. This could lead to a more or less finalized design for a cheap and hopefully quick to build light surface combatant, leveraging Australian components wherever possible, which could theoretically be put into production at fairly short notice if needed. Funding might also be considered to assist Austal in upgrading and expanding its facilities to allow for the construction of larger vessels at Henderson, purely to have that latent capacity available if it ever becomes required. Now, I realize that any design which emerges from such a process would probably end up looking very different from what I've thought about and outlined here. But I do think that there's value, even if you can't predict the actual ship, in thinking through the requirements for what that kind of vessel might look like, as well as the options to achieve it, and in so doing, demonstrating that as long as you're willing to think a little differently and make some hard choices, Australia really could be in a position to once again find itself defended by some seriously capable homegrown ships, just as we were in World War II.